Welcome, thinkers, to Season 3, Episode 19 of Thinking Critically. Today's topic is consequences. And today I'm joined by Brandon, aka Rev from the CritShow. Thank you ever so much for joining us today, Rev. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am the host and GM of the CritShow, which is an actual play podcast where we play Monster of the Week and other Powered by the Apocalypse games, all within the same dimension-hopping narrative.
Amazing. Well, today's topic should be very relevant, I guess, in that it is consequences. So, what does that mean to you in the wider ttrpg framework?
Yeah, so, a lot of the stuff that we play is Powered by the Apocalypse, Fate, things like that, and consequences are scaled so drastically just in the format of the roles of those games. When you're playing Powered by the Apocalypse, for example, you roll 2d6 and a 7 to 9 is a mixed success, meaning that you get what you want, but there's also a complication. There's a consequence for it. And then a 6 and under is just a fail. There's a huge consequence. And so consequences, ever since we started our show, and I've noticed how much it's filtered over just kind of into my home games, have become so important in the sense of the scope of them. It kind of makes me think of, if you're familiar with the Mikado, where they talk about let the punishment fit the crime, that, the size of the consequences got to be proportionate to the size of the thing that they were attempting to do.
In those systems, and pardon my ignorance, you'll have to educate me a little bit. In those systems, when there is, either a minor or a major mishap, for lack of a better term, I love that kind of micro moment-to-moment improvisation required of the GM.
Yeah.
But my question is that, the only onus of the GM to think of those consequences in that, very short period of time? And if so, how do you do it?
I really think it comes down to your group and your table. I've played at games where it is up to the GM to come up with those, mixed successes. But there are also times where I've played in games where the GM is like, okay, so, they're trying to do this. It is successful, because intent is so important in this. It's like, if you're trying to run out the door and close the door before a monster gets through it. It's like, okay, so what's your main focus? Is it getting out the door first ahead of the rest of the group? Is it closing the door securely? Like, what is it? And they're like, okay, well, it's to make sure everybody's out and to close the door. Like, to make sure everyone's out before I close the door.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so on a mixed success, that's the minimum thing you do accomplish. But here's the consequence to it. And so sometimes the GM will open it up to the table. Like, okay, so what do we think? Like, what could be some possible ramifications here? Like, oh, well, the creature slams hard against the door and it starts to crack, so it's not going to hold long. Or, as you all rush through, someone trips and their hand hits the fire alarm. And that a bunch of people, like innocent people now, are going to be called here. Like a bunch of firefighters are going to show up.
Yeah.
For me, in our podcast, I actually have gotten into the format, and part of it because I think I kind of read the rules incorrectly the first time we played. But in a mixed success, it says that there's, it comes at a cost, a price to pay, or a sacrifice, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I thought it was saying all three of them.
Oh.
So I was giving the player three options. Like, okay, either this is going to be the way it is, this is the way, or this is the way. Which one do you think? And it's kind of become something I really like doing. And the way that I come up with them is I just try to imagine myself in that situation in the moment. If I'm trying to climb up a rope to escape from, this creature below, and I feel myself slip and fall, it's like, oh, I want to try to catch myself. Well, if I was in that situation, what are some things that could happen to me? Well, I could catch myself and like rip up my hands, or I could catch myself and like some stuff in my pockets is going to fall out, or I catch myself and like that rope starts to fray and it's not going to hold long, so I have to find something else to climb onto. And so I always try to put myself in the shoes of the player who's just tried to do something and think about like, okay, what options make sense? And then I do let them choose between the three options that I give them of what is the slight failure there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a nice double-edged sword of player agency. Like you've given them a choice, but obviously there's no winning choices.
Yeah, it's like, this is not going to go well, but in what way do you feel the most comfortable with it not going well?
Yeah. And I also loved where you mentioned there that sometimes it is a collaborative effort, to come up with those ideas. And that is the real definition of collaborative storytelling. That term gets bandied around a lot for D&D, but 9 times out of 10 I might say 9 times out of 10, the second page of the player's handbook says the DM narrates the consequences of the results of those actions. So, and that totes itself as collaborative storytelling. But in a way, it's kind of pulling its punches a little bit because it isn't. Because it says there on the second page, the DM tells you what the outcome is. Whereas what you've described is like true collaborative storytelling, in that the players get a hand in not only the actions but also the outcomes, the consequences of those actions, which I really love. I'm a bit scared of like the trust level required there. There's got to be another layer of like maturity and trust on top to be able to like, I broke a nail when I was, when you're climbing up the cliff, and then the GM has to go, well, that's not really that's not really a consequence for not climbing very well, unless your nails are magical weapons that can hurt people. Then but
and what I really enjoy about it is that it really pulls you away from, there's this really old mindset, depending on the kinds of games you've played and the kinds of game masters you've played with, of the us versus them, and. And I totally get that. Is some people, they love that. That's totally fine. But I am a big fan of hey, we're working together to tell a story. And I'm going to say some things. I'm going to make some decisions that are going to be hard on you or rough on your character or whatever. But it is all in the intent of telling this really compelling narrative between all of us.
Yeah, and that space there is a tricky one to build into, and to really build that comfort and confidence with your players to not take the piss and and then just trust them to build you that story. And often it's that is absolutely like a session 0 kind of thing out the gate. Like, this is the kind of game that I want to play, is one where we're building it all together. Whereas I think the one that I play is a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. A lot of my players would prefer to be excluded from the consequence decision making, in a sense that although I am only human, and to err is human, and I am in no way free of any bias, I am still somewhat, as the DM of my campaign, a objective, or at least intended to be, an objective power. So by removing the players' decisions from the outcome, I think they prefer to be like, they can trust me at least, which is a position of responsibility.
And with these types of games, you get that element of it when it comes to the full failure, like a 6 and under triggers what in those games they call a hard move by the game master. And so those are things usually that are plot relevant or monster relevant or whatever, that I have thought up ahead of time or make sense in the moment, that they just get the ramification of it. They don't really have the same level of input as they do on those mixed successes.
Well, that's where the fun lies, in the mixed successes. That's where it's cool to work with them, because it is that middle ground of like, oh, let's have some fun here. There's wiggle room, right? It isn't like, this is super bad now. It's like, it's a little bit bad, but let's work out how that
you still got what you want, but not quite how you wanted it.
That is interesting. And I think it's a failing of, and excuse me for falling back on my D&D expertise here, but that's the one of the points of today's discussion, is to see where it it differs in the similarities and the differences with other systems. But I think that's a failing of D&D, is that I think at some point somewhere, probably in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it will say like, have a sliding scale for, you know, successes in binary. It isn't just you meet the DC. You can have a sliding DC scale.
Yeah.
But it's never, you know, for a newbie who's just picked up Lost Mines or the starter kit or something, that isn't, it is probably going to be a very binary, like, well, the DC says 15 and they hit 14. They didn't do what they're going to do. And
yeah,
it's a shame in a way. I'd prefer it to be a little bit more baked into the fundamental mechanics, that idea of a scale, a success scale.
Yeah, like this knowledge check's really difficult. It's a 27. Oh, you get a 26. You know nothing. It's like, well, there's got to be some stuff they know, right?
Yeah. When you put it like that, it's so like hilariously obvious that like such a high roll at 26, and they're like, "Nah, you're dumbfounded. You've never read this relatively common language before in your life." What do these weird symbols mean on this piece of paper? Oh, it's just a coffee menu, right? Okay, cool. You were one away. So, one of the things that I thought about when preparing for today's discussion was all of those memes you see about like, oh, how was I to know there was going to be consequences for my actions? Or,
yeah.
Oh no, look what it is. It's the consequences of my actions, which I love because it's so, you know, it's funny because it's true. And I think more so with TTRPGs, when you have the surprised Pikachu face players that are like, oh, snap, that thing I did is now biting me in the backside. And I have to say, one of the allures of GMing for new players is watching that penny drop. All like penny drop moments in any discipline, in any area or any profession are always wonderful things to witness. That's why teaching is a thing that people like to do, because it's the thrill of watching the light bulb go. And that is the TTRPG equivalent of when you see people be like, yes, I'm not playing Dragon Age anymore. Okay. That moment is great. And one of the ways you can get to that moment is through consequences of the player actions. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that, or any particularly pertinent examples of those light bulb moments.
Yeah, you know, we as a group, we run a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games at conventions. And I would say probably 80% of the time, it's people who have never played one before, but they've heard about one, and so they want to get a chance to do it. And so first you have that step of, oh yeah, so you've kind of failed this thing. How do you think you failed it? And you get that moment of, is this a trick? Why are you asking me how I think
test?
Yeah. But then once you get to, like, the only notes I really take as a GM, like if you were to look behind my screen, it's mostly just random pen marks.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I don't need a whole lot to run the story that I'm doing, but I do want to take notes of those little things that come up. You know, oh yeah, we pulled into the parking lot here as we went in, and, you know, we noticed that there was someone in the parking lot, and so we made sure to park right next to them because they weren't parked correctly in the lines, and it just kind of pissed me off. And so then later, like when there's a complication, like, oh yeah, you go out, and you know, you're all trying to escape from this place. You've set off the fire alarm. You got to get out of here. And you notice that one of your tires is slashed, and there's a note on your car, and it says, "Thanks for parking so close." You know, finding ways to lead those consequences, or to pull those consequences from the things that they have set up, is one of my favorite things, so that you never feel like you're getting struck out of left field.
Yeah, as a player, you mean? Yeah, exactly. And again, that ties back nicely into that whole trust piece and the difference between a them versus us gameplay, because in that instance, the them versus me versus them, or whatever it is, the players are very reticent to ever make themselves vulnerable. So in that example, they would have been, no, I spend another minute backing back out and reversing, you know, pulling back in the bay, making sure I'm 6 inches from the line either side. Nice, good. That's not going to come and hit me later. So yeah, whereas in this collaborative storytelling version, again, you can trust the players to put their characters in more vulnerable situations by making suboptimal decisions, or by saying or doing foolish things that can be, misconstrued by the NPCs or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, they can trust you into not hitting them out of their field or just completely whipping the rug out from under them and be like,
yeah.
you've when they parked outside of the bay, you open the door and as you turn the ignition, a bomb goes off because like slashing the tires makes sense, but
Right.
someone was so pissed you parked outside the bay, they did this. That's just like, that doesn't make any sense, GM, and now we're not having fun. So I love that.
Mm-hmm.
That trust is very much a two-way street. It is not just the GM trusting the players, it is the players having to trust the GM as well to make things make sense and to be like, no, that's fair. That slash tire is completely fair and deserved, and it makes sense because the world feels alive. Thanks, GM.
Well, and I think too that something that's really important narratively, and it's something that you kind of bump into when you play Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons, that just because you fail, just because there's a consequence to your action, it doesn't mean that it's not still badass.
Yeah.
Like you can fail in a really cool way as opposed to like, oh yeah, you didn't hit the AC, so you miss.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not an interesting thing to describe, but if they fail on an attack, in Monster of the Week against a creature, it's like, oh yeah, you run up and you jam the sword down onto it and you realize as you get close that its flesh is really craggy and part of the blade breaks off. You can tell this thing has such a thick skin that your sword just can't penetrate it. And so you still give them a cool cinematic moment. It's not like, oh yeah, you trip and fall, you're bad at this. You still make them feel cool in their consequences.
Mm-hmm. Which is a tricky thing to do as a DM, or let me put it another way, as not a professional improviser. It is hard to come up with those unique things like on a consistent basis.
Oh yeah,
at a high level, like throughout all the kinds of interactions and times that things can go bad. It's not so bad when you're playing a system that has levels and the characters are lower levels because it's more feasible for them to. You slipped on the banana skin. Whoops, haha, slapstick comedy. That's fine. That makes sense today. Once.
Yeah, exactly.
But then when they're like level 10 and swinging from rafters and firing fireballs and stuff on the rare occasion where they do fail quite bad, it's really incongruent to be like, oh, you slipped and fell on your bum. Well, hang on, I've been a master acrobat now for like 50 years. Like, that would never happen.
Yeah,
and it makes my cool character look stupid. Cool, thanks.
Yeah,
GM.
Yeah. I was listening to something earlier where someone had failed a relatively simple roll, and the game master was like, "Why do you what goes wrong here?" And they were like, "Oh, when we walked in, there was all this smoke in the air, and I think it's not just smoke. Like I think someone is burning something, and it's getting into my system that it's clouding my thoughts. And I think that I try to do this spell, and it just doesn't. Like I don't have all the pieces at the forefront of my brain because of this smoke." And so, giving them the chance to like, okay, again, why do you think this went wrong? Like we know it went wrong. That's what the dice have told us.
Yeah.
But we don't know narratively why it went wrong. Like, what do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna try and float that idea to my players next time. I'm very happy with this learning moment for me now. Next time we play, which will be a week away, if an opportunity presents itself, I might be like, hey, let's, I can't be the only improvisational, creative font here. Let's open it to the floor. Well, what would be a funny and interesting way here to to see what happens?
When it does, it shares the workload too. Because if you go back and if you listen to our show where I'm generating these, in our first 2 seasons, they can't all be gems. No. It's sometimes they're like, okay, they're sneaking down a hallway, and oh, you failed this roll. Yeah, you bend over to tie your shoe, and you guys talked about eating on the way here. You just fart really loudly in the hallway, and all of a sudden your stealth is blown, and it's, okay, that one's not cool, but I got a good laugh out of them. So it's also about knowing your group and like what's the mix of humor versus in character story. What's that balance of the consequences?
Yeah, this is why I love TTRPGs, and this show is to hopefully highlight that it is hard. Like micromanaging that balance for every, not just the GM, for the players are just as responsible. micromanaging that balance in any given situation is a very tricky thing and a very practicable skill. Like you can get better at it. But yeah, just knowing when, when's too far, when you need to pull back, when you need to push forward is, in terms of like narrative fluff, and is a fart going to be here good here? Is it going to be, puerile here? And kind of is again, comes with experience, comes with knowledge, comes with ownership to a certain extent. But I'm very much behind that idea of kind of sharing the load. And again, I don't want to turn this into like, oh, isn't the poor GM hard? Life's hard. He's got to do all this work, which is which is why I'm saying like, no, the players have that burden as well. But
yeah,
certainly the way I still play in that, as I said, I tend to do most of the flavor narration. The players have the opportunity to do so. Some of my players are not really bothered by it. Oh, and just say, I hit it with my greatsword. I hit it with my greatsword, which is fine. But otherwise, it's down to me. And yeah, absolutely, it's draining. And you're at the end, you're just you're operating on fumes, and it does just come down to you hit it with a sword a little bit different from the side because I've used every synonym for parry in the last 4 hours of play that my brain just said no more words for you, Danilo. You can just say the sword hits the other sword. So one of the main things that often gets discussed hand in hand with consequences is the idea of murder hoboism, as I'm coining it. And I'm not sure how much of a big deal it is in the systems that you play. And also, I'm not frankly sure how much of really a big deal it is in games that you play with people you know. I have a sneaky suspicion, my gut is telling me it's more of an issue with pickup groups and randoms. However, saying that, that's the archetypical, like, the players have gone and doing some stuff which is just immoral, amoral, bad within the universe, whatever, however you want to describe it. And that is the classic one that says, well, I'd be a rich man if I had £1 for every thread I've seen, every comment I've seen that's like, how do I deal with this? They murdered the merchant in the middle of his village. And that always strikes me as an interesting question, meta in a way, because in of itself it's not an interesting question. It's quite a boring question. But the fact that it's being asked is interesting to me because it's like, well, the whole point of TTRPGs is that it's this dynamic world that you're living in. Even if you play super raw, super mechanical, super optimal, it's still fundamentally a dynamic world that reacts in the most dynamic way ever to the actions of the players, be it mechanical or abstract actions. So the whole premise is predicated on this dynamic feedback. So at the moment anyone says like, my players have done action A, how do I respond? To me, that's like, how do I play the game in a way? Like, what should I do here? That's for me personally. That's the meat on the. That's why I'm there, to answer those questions. I love those questions in my game. I'm like, oh, brilliant! They've given me all this material. This is where I get to flex my my muscles. So, but fortunately enough, my players haven't gone full off off the tracks. But what about you? Have you got any tips, any thoughts on? Let's start with the extreme, the classic murder hoboism of just completely pointless, chaotic, evil nonsense.
Yeah, it's something that really caught me off guard the first time that I encountered it, because when I first started playing TTRPGs, I started with Earth Dawn, and Earth Dawn's whole system is based off of legend points, meaning that you don't get experience from killing creatures. You get character growth by people knowing of the heroic deeds that you've done. And so, there was no choice really but to be a hero, because that's how you gained experience. That's how you became more popular, more well-known. And the whole game really is based around the idea of, you're a group of heroes trying to do a thing. And if you start to, behave in a chaotic, evil way, the forces that you're out there to fight against will start to corrupt you and pull you to their side to the point where you'll have to give your character over to the game master. So it wasn't really something that I ever dealt with until much later. But I remember very distinctly the first time sitting down with a group of people and, we were playing a game kind of set in our world. And this person gets a bazooka out and blows up like a power station.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were shocked when the police and the fire department showed up and like drew on them and told them they were under arrest. And so I think that a lot of that has to deal with your session 0, that you got to establish, with your players, like, okay, like what are the rules of the world here? How are we playing this? Are NPCs, disposable dime a dozen things that you can just use as you see fit and ignore the rest of the time? Or are they kind of complex characters that can aid and hinder you as you go through your story? I think the more realistic and kind of dynamic you can make the characters that they're interacting with, the harder it will be for them just to be like, oh, this is nameless innkeeper. I murder him because he's got more coins than I do. But again, it really does come down to that session 0 of, what are kind of our lines and our veils, and what is the society here? How are murderers treated in this instance? Or, what's the, in any small town within the principalities here, what's the punishment for thievery? And just kind of setting that out as a group, because that'll tell you a lot about the world the players want to play in. I never build my world until the players have made their characters, because they tell you so much of the story that they want to play by the characters they create and the backstories they give themselves, that if you can then find ways to incorporate this person has a high thievery and a high backstab. Well, I know that they want to use that, obviously. So what kind of thing can I put in their way that, morally isn't just them doing this to whoever they find, but, oh yeah, there's this corrupt group who's doing, X, Y, and Z. How are you going to deal with them?
Again, another world building challenge for the GM.
Yeah.
There. Do you think then at that session 0 that you mentioned, it would be useful to have like hypothetical situations to then, at least work with the players, or if the world is already pre-set up, for sake of argument, players, if somebody kills somebody in this world, they will be, the police will do everything in their power to apprehend that person and put them in prison. That is his one hypothetical example of a crime being committed in the world. That's before we've even started playing, that's what's going to happen. Do you think that's beneficial to either build that at the time with the players, as you said, or already have them pre-baked?
And I think, one of my favorite session 0s I've ever done was, we sat down, we generated characters, we talked about the world a little bit, and then each player had just like a 10 or 15 minute session alone with the game master. We were all still there, but it was them going through a couple of things, using their important skills, and them just kind of getting an opportunity to feel each other out in the sense of, how they were going to play the character, what things were, relevant to them. Because then that gives you a chance to adapt things or adjust things between that and your first session.
Yeah. And again, that's a failing that I have unwittingly committed myself in, not, it's so easy to think of session 0 as one thing when it is in fact 20 million different things
right
all at once, and it has a lot of baggage nowadays, for better and for worse. And of course it does all of those things and more, and in fact it's in some cases it probably needs to be longer than a regular session in a weird upside down turn of events rather than just his scene setting. It needs to be all of this stuff, not just if you kill, bad things will happen to you, but also like, here's these nations and here's this background, and what does your how did your character grow up again? Oh yeah, let me think about, we could maybe do this. And I think there's a lot to be said for doing that in kind of full transparency of the other players, if you have the opportunity to do so, because it builds that shared universe. Everybody's invested a little bit, at the very least of their time, which is hugely important to people, to be like, no, this is the our world, and that has already started to maybe mitigate that chaotic evil play, because people have invested time into this world and they don't want to immediately, the first time they step foot in it, they don't want to just tear it down.
Yeah, there's a game that we played a couple of years ago that was part of the session 0. They had a mechanic that you went through on the world building. It was like, okay, so there are corporations that run this city, and there is as many corporations as there are players. Each person describe one corporation and what they're in charge of. And so it was like, okay, well, there's this one person came up with, there's this group and they do all of like transportation. They do the subways, they do the buses, they do the taxis, and they use that as a system to, filter money. And someone else was like, oh yeah, there's a group who does all of like the defense contracts. And so then as they start to build that world, even if you have a home brew world that you want to do, letting the players in your session 0 build like their starting location and then dropping that into your map that you have gives them that sense of kind of ownership over the place where we first find them and get to know them.
Yeah, absolutely. I it sounds so obvious, not just what you're saying, but what everything we've talked about so far on paper. It's like, well, duh. But in reality,
it's a lot.
It is a lot, and it's so hard to be able to get all your chickens in a line and get everybody ready and have players who wish to do that. As I said, like I've got a whole mix of players, some who are very keen on that kind of stuff, some who do the bare minimum, I think is fair to say, in terms of world building and fluff and backstory. In fact, one of the players' characters died recently, and they had I gave them 4 weeks over the Christmas holidays, the winter holidays, to build a new character. I've said, like, here's the list of all the NPCs you know. Here's the list. Here's the session logs for the last 68 sessions. Riff off of this wealth of material, and he left it until the night before, about 11 p.m., to send me a half-baked backstory. So, balancing that... I don't want to say it's like a job in a way, because every game is different and some games are smooth like butter and others have these weird bumps in the road like mine tend to do. But it is just a dance, basically. It's a delicate dance between making sure all these plates are kept spinning and everybody's happy that the plates are spinning in the direction they want them to spin. to really butcher an already tenuous metaphor there.
Well, and because you're going to have players who, you're going to have that player that sends you a 7-page backstory that has NPCs named and items that are important to them that maybe they could find later. And then you also have the player who is just there to roll dice and feel like a badass in combat. And my mom is Jane and my dad is Joe. And, again, you talked about that delicate dance of finding that balance of, okay, this character clearly wants to role play and this character clearly wants to like do a dungeon crawl. So how can I place these role playing elements within the dungeon crawl so that no one feels like their desired game isn't kind of happening?
Yeah. And thank you for providing me a very nice opportunity to do some self-promotion here, because I made some tweets recently around that there's a discourse that I find a bit of a waste of time, to be completely frank, in the whole like rules versus fun debate. And those who do follow me on Twitter will probably remember this tweet, because my point is that is not a discussion. That those two things are apples and oranges. You can't compare them like that, because the rules are the fun for some players.
Yeah.
So it's not a rules or fun. It's the rules are the fun for that player. That the actual discussion is somebody likes rules and somebody doesn't like them as much.
Do these two people belong in the same game, or how can I, make a mix of, because especially if you play, any version of D&D before 5e, or if you play Pathfinder, you have to love rules, because there's a rule for everything, and you spend so much time looking them up that, there is an element of, when sometimes to relax, we play a much more complicated game than the one we do on our podcast, because there is something that's fun about all of the skill checks and, getting those certain bumps and the magic items that let you do this special thing, as opposed to the fun of, I just describe what happens narratively and it happens because, I have a high enough stat. Those are two very different kinds of fun that, depending on the day of the week, it kind of depends on which one you're in the mood for.
Absolutely. And I've said to multiple times, my own players, in fact, that same player who, turned up at 11 p.m. with a half-baked character sheet, I've said to him before in the past, like, hey, I've noticed some friction with your interaction with the world or even playing. Have you considered playing this other system, this other framework that is more conducive to that play style? Because you're trying to put a square peg in a round hole sometimes, the round hole being 5th edition, and maybe if we can find you a square hole, you'll have a lot more fun to not deftly skirt around any euphemisms there. But so it's a consequence of the game system you pick to butcher a way of trying to bring us back onto
yes
to try and crowbar us back onto the track. I guess a consequence of us having too much fun is get derailing.
We got off topic.
ever so slightly. Yes, it's all this interconnectedness. But one question I was going to have for you then is, have you got any standout, like any classic surprise peek at your face consequences for your players in your career? Has there ever been any bits that you've, I don't want to say blindsided them because that suggests that it was unfair or whatever, but any moments that were like, oh yeah, whoops, we messed up?
Yeah. Like, because a big thing is that realizing that, consequences has a negative connotation, but when a character fails at something, that's usually where some of the coolest storytelling comes from. We don't go into a movie theater to watch the character succeed in their final goal in the first 10 minutes. No, they fail a bunch, and then we get to see their rise to glory. And so I think just, keeping that in mind, that if you can make the players and yourself see that the consequences are how much fun they can be, or how much consequence they can have in the story that you're telling. One of my favorite ones is they were dealing with this person who could generate a lot of offspring.
Okay.
And they were able to kill this creature, but one of the offspring got away. And then, like 3 seasons later, they came across another one of this offspring and realized that it was like the great granddaughter of this thing they had fought so long ago. And because they didn't deal with all of them, here was another one that had come looking for them. And so just those little things. My favorite consequences are when they're like, we got to put a pin in that and deal with that later.
Yeah.
And then they forget. And then you can bring that moment back up later. And there's always just such a good reaction at the table of, oh my God, I forgot about that. And it is that, if it isn't the ramifications of my own actions.
Yeah. No, I love that as well. It's such a Machiavellian delight as a GM to be like, I'm going to remember that. You guys might not, but I and the world are definitely going to remember that. A couple of examples from my game. My players, they went to a jeweler's, I guess, a jewelry shop that's run by a less than legal goblin in my fantasy world, who, he was called Sleaze. I think that pretty much speaks for itself, right? It was a dodgy venture from the outset. He was clearly not legal, and they still attempted to like swindle him and rob and steal from this goblin who's by himself. It's just one dude in a shop trying to sell you some diamonds so you can revive your friends. But like, how did he get that shop, and where did he get all these diamonds from, and all these other questions? So long story short is they tried to swindle him, didn't quite work. It didn't explode at that point. There wasn't like roll initiative, everyone fights, okay, close the book on that. It ended as amicable as it could have done. But for me, as the DM, I was very much like, yeah, he's got connections.
Mm.
That goblin network in my world is extensive, and they all, they're all in cahoots, and he's got, bigger brothers that are are gonna pay the players a visit, shall we say, at some point down the line for bullying this, the store owner at this point. So I'm like, yeah, that's just pop that little note somewhere, little post-it note somewhere, and we'll just let that stew for a couple of months, and we'll see. And I am very much looking forward to that comeuppance to sound like a parent.
Just long enough
Yeah.
for them to have forgotten about it.
Yeah, precisely. And then I also wanted to add a positive spin. So recently, the only two surviving player characters, there was a cataclysm in a big city. There was a bunch of MP, half the population was unfortunately killed for various plot reasons. And long story short is that the two surviving player characters, one is this charlatan warlock who is very all style, no substance, very manipulative, very typically warlocky, flamboyant, flashy, doesn't ever lift a finger, but tells everybody he lifts both hands. So when he was leaving the city, he was like, tell everybody, that it was me that saved the day, and I'm the reason you're still here alive. But then left them while they're literally in humanitarian relief efforts. Whereas the other one is a Goliath blood hunter barbarian, but very kind-hearted, kind-souled. So when as I did with the warlock before him, on his way out of the city, I was like, there's relief efforts, and they're asking, all hands on deck, we need to clear the rubble, this, that, and the other. He was like, yeah, okay, I'll go and help. I'm way stronger than these people. So I was like, okay, what do you do? And here's the kind of things you can do, and how long do you want to spend doing it? The day, a week, or just resolve this one small issue they have to find this one missing person and then go. And he was like, oh, I'll spend a day, 8 hours or whatnot. And I was like, yeah. And I rated it. They love you. They, they are so thankful for your efforts. Anytime you come back, you'll have a place to say, you've saved the lives of 10 people because you've been clearing all this rubble because you're a huge, strong barbarian. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So he left. So that you kind of got two different parallel stories there. Now, one of my other characters, one of my other players who is rebuilding another character, he's come back. And one of the ways that his new character has been introduced to the party is because he's like, oh yeah, I heard of your two exploits. You're the two saviors of this city, right? And of course, the warlock is like, yes, God, they know me. They've heard of me. I didn't do anything. Whereas this very humble and modest Goliath barbarian is like, oh yeah, I guess I helped a bit. But my point being is that you've got there, if you're fortunate enough like I am, you can have players even build off each other's, provide consequences to the other player's actions, and it's in a favorable light. Yes, there was a bit of deception on the part of the warlock, but broadly, I guess he did save some of them indirectly, but it's in a favorable light. It isn't this, the world's going to explode in 7 weeks because you forgot to turn the oven off before you left for adventuring. It's
right.
It's like you had this stuff, and now people have heard of you in the world for your good deeds. So yes, that was my two examples. I just wanted to very, very recent examples that I wanted to mention there as perhaps an inspiration for other people.
Yeah.
Introducing a new character is always tricky, both from the player and the GM. So that was such an easy win for both me and the player to be like, yes, you've heard of their exploits. Absolutely great. I love it. You're now best friends. As soon as you've turned up, they're ready to have you in the party, which is always that tricky question to be like, well, why do you want to adventure with you?
Yeah. Well, and it's really nice too, again, we're talking about consequences, but to also balance that with, like you just said, the things that you take note of, the things that you remember that hit them in a positive way. Mm-hmm. That, oh yeah, you helped this little girl do this thing, and later on when you're in this tough situation and people don't believe you, you know who you see in the audience? It's that little girl, and she stands up and starts talking on your behalf. And that, if you want to be, and you should be meticulous with crafting your consequences, putting as much energy into crafting rewards for things that they do is super important, and goes back into that whole building a trust at a table where everyone feels comfortable helping generate consequences for another player that seem fair and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to, it's both sides of the coin you need to fulfill as a GM. Otherwise, you do foster, unfortunately, that them versus us mentality, because it is very one way. And no, absolutely, it needs to be two ways. If, of course, the players and their characters are providing you opportunities to to provide reward and recognition, which is often not the case, as we discussed earlier on. But a good example of what you just mentioned there is in a video game, Resident Evil 4. Like right at the beginning, there's like a wolf trapped in a bear trap, and you hear it kind of whining, and you can go up and you can let it out, and it runs off into the forest and disappears. And as a player, the first time I vividly remember doing this however many years ago when I first was playing it through on GameCube, I think, if memory serves. And you're like, oh, okay, that was cool. And then I think at the first like mini boss you fight at one point, the wolf comes in, and it literally, like as you described, like it's literally on the edge of the arena that you're fighting this boss in. It howls, jumps into the arena, and then distracts the boss so you can get a bunch of hits in and get like a freebie in. And that's a classic, very linear, very binary, one direction, but still a very good example of just that how clean and crisp sometimes it has to be. It doesn't have to be this 6 months later, the tree that you planted, the seed that you planted grew into a mighty oak, and now there's a new village that live in the tree. No, it doesn't need to be that complicated. Sometimes it can be as simple as, hey, you fed that dog and now the dog wants to follow you.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked an awful lot about consequences in universe, in game, for better and for worse. Now, obviously, it isn't all in game. We are playing with other human beings, and human beings, as I've previously mentioned, are imperfect. And sometimes there are, people make mistakes, people play in a different way that you don't want them to play. What I am getting to is, have you ever had the unfortunate experience of, having to perhaps have, quote unquote, the discussion with a player to be like, hey, this isn't working because of your actions, or because of what's happening here, or hey, we've talked about this and it's still an issue. Maybe you might want to think about a different table that suits your predilections. Have you ever been in that unfortunate position?
Yeah, once or twice, where it ultimately comes up to, kind of what we talked about earlier, people's game styles, their play styles bumping into one another. I've been super fortunate in that I've never had to deal with some of the much more uncomfortable reasons why that would be an issue.
Yeah.
I've been a part of those talks, but never the game master at that table. But it's sometimes it's about finding the right game for the group. If it's like, this is our group and this is who we always play with, and we're playing this game, and there's a lot of friction between these two players. Okay, is that friction normally there? If so, what's the cause of it? And finding out, like you said earlier, is there a different hole to try that peg in? But then when it comes to pickup groups and things like that, I find that it's best to deal with it as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Whenever we run games at a convention, we always have lines and veils that people fill out beforehand. And then we also have an X card on the table. And, for anybody unfamiliar with the X card, if a player holds up the X card, whatever was just said, you basically rewind and you do it a different way. It's a way for someone to say, like, hey, this makes me uncomfortable, without having to go into why.
Yeah. And
so there have been moments where you have to pull someone aside and say, hey, like, I realize that you're playing this character this way. Like, you want to be, let's say, the hard-boiled detective who, because of the time period, is a womanizer. But you can't talk to other players like that. So how can we still create the feel that you want of this loner without encroaching on someone else's enjoyment of the game? Because, ultimately, that's what it boils down to. Is we want to make sure, as the game master, that everybody at the table is having a good time. And as soon as one person isn't having a good time, especially if it's because of, the actions of another player, that's when a game master's job becomes work. As opposed to, we talked earlier about, like, oh, poor me, I've got to do all this work. But it can become work when it just becomes about figuring out if it's a problem player or a problem character.
Yeah. Well, I count myself as well in just a fortunate position as yourself, where I haven't had to have any of those too many difficult discussions. But you see a lot of them online, and I've mentioned it many times before, of people being like, one of my players was hideously racist. How do I deal with this? And I'm like, well, this isn't really a ttrpg question at this point. This is just this is just a racist person question.
Yeah.
And you just deal with that how you would deal with someone doing that in any given thing you do in your daily life as normal.
Right. Like there's no need to come to Reddit for that. What's your gut reaction? Shut them down, please.
Yeah. And so yeah, that always. I don't know for why, because I can't think of another medium where this is a problem. So, like for example, like football has soccer for my American listeners. Certainly, the UK has at least had how should we say this, a storied history. Funnily enough, when it comes to racism, and that isn't a football problem. That's just a English person problem to paint my country in a horrible light. God. But like, no one's like, oh, we need to change the rules of the game, or like, we need to dance around this topic and ask why this player isn't having fun in the same way. Like, that's not a TTRPG question, and you don't need to cater or pander. Like, that is an egregious example, I know, but it eventually gets to that point where that person has to have the consequences to their action. And there is I don't want to say a simplicity, but there is an elegance in the solution, which is to say, goodbye, leave my game now. Like,
right.
You're not playing with us anymore. And for some reason, I find there's a lot of preciousness around kicking people out of games, which is the logical conclusion of such an egregious example of being a bad human being. Almost like people feel like they are denying somebody else this fun that we talk about so often. And again, it's just, I don't know, it's just a weird discussion point for my brain, why people feel that way, why there is a preciousness about kicking people out of the game when some examples I've read have literally been that bad.
Yeah.
And they're still like, oh, I can't kick him from a game because he's, my colleague, or I work with him. Okay, completely pointless bits of information that have no bearing on what's just occurred here, but fine. He could be your dad and like, or, your partner, and the discussion would be very similar.
Yeah, like I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound like I'm being tongue in cheek, and I'm really not. But you have these people who are so concerned about the consequences of, if I kick this person out of my game, what are the ramifications going to be at my job, on my commute, on my whatever? Yeah, and there's also that element too of, and it's not maybe as much of a problem anymore.
Yeah,
because of what's happened in the pandemic and kind of the influx of people playing games online over Skype or Discord or whatever. But there also used to be a real, well, we can't kick them out because we don't have another player. And if it's just the three of us, we can't really play a game.
Yeah.
And so there was a time period, I think, where there was that weird, like, well, you just got to deal with whoever's willing to play because only a handful of people are interested in playing. But in today's space, if you're dealing with somebody who is problematic for yourself or the other players or the story, man, just join a Discord and find someone who wants to Skype into your game and don't have that thorn in your boot.
Thank you for spinning my inadvertently sad topic of discussion into a positive at the end there. I was well worried we were going to close on like humans suck. But no, you've redeemed the episode.
Don't get me wrong. Some humans suck. Let's be honest.
Sure. But yes, you've redeemed the episode to be like, no, the hobby's so good now and so popular that there's always people to fill those gaps. So, every cloud, which is far better to end on than whatever I was talking about. So no, thank you ever so much for that. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't got to yet?
No, not really. I think, like I said, I started out playing Earth Dawn and then I played Pathfinder. And that's exclusively what I played for a very long time. And starting to play, Monster of the Week, Dungeon World, any of these Powered by the Apocalypse games or Fate games, I didn't realize how much I was missing till I started playing other games. And it's that would be my one thing is like, hey, next time you're at a convention or next time someone brings up a new game, like give it a shot. Even if you don't play it right, you're going to find some really cool stuff because, D&D has become the gold standard because it's been around so long and it's been, made so popular by things like Critical Role or the Adventure Zone. But even they end up branching into another game every now and then, and you can really see the story take a different shape. And a lot of them are so simple to learn. You think of like, oh, I don't want to learn a new game because you're thinking of learning something the size of Pathfinder or something the size of Dungeons and Dragons, where a lot of these games are one 100-page book and that's all you need to play.
Yeah, I must admit I suffer from that train of thought of being like, no matter how much I've played my precious 5th edition, session to session, there's still these edge case niche questions come up that's like, oh, you're carrying, but can you throw? Or how many hands do you need to do this and this, that, and the other? And so there's never an end to the rules-based questioning, so that when somebody does suggest, do you want to learn a new system? I'm like, man, I haven't even learned this one yet.
Yeah.
But give me another 5 years maybe and we'll get there. But but no, I think you're absolutely right in that they are not, not everything has to be that weird niche edge case issue for the next 5 years. You can just pick it up and play. And I'm being an extreme hypocrite here, having not had a huge amount of experience, but such is life.
We are a multitude.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you ever so much for today's discussion. I'm super stoked with everything we've discussed. I personally really wanted to talk about get some examples in of the surprised Pikachu face, because as we discussed, there's just that Machiavellian delight there that itch can't be scratched by many other things. So
yeah,
glad we talked about that. And then also obviously the real world issues. And I think because that is important. You and I are in the main fortunate enough to have not had that, but it is exceptionally important to many other people. So I'm very thankful for your insight and your input on things such as the X card and the veils and so on and so on. So thank you very much for all of that. Is there anything you would like to promote?
Really, if you're interested in learning some of these Powered by the Apocalypse games, you can find us at the CritShowPodcast.com and at the Crit Show on most everything. And we run our game in a way that after the first story arc, you should feel comfortable sitting down and playing it yourself. We try to explain the rules as we go without stopping the flow of the action. So it's a lot of explaining how mechanics work to the players as they're dealing with them for the first time. And we keep our episodes, we come out every Wednesday, and episodes are usually between 35 to 55 minutes. So they're very digestible and you'll learn a whole bunch of new systems, but it'll still be the same narrative as we go through.
Amazing. Very cool. Very unique idea. I think you open the show with that kind of shared universe thing, which I'm going to have you back on again to discuss the consequences of running something like that, which is something that we didn't get to that I wanted to talk about, but we'll save that one for round 2. But
excellent.
So all that's left to say is thank you ever so much, Rev, for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you everybody for listening at home. As usual, all the links to the Crit Show will be in the episode description, and I, of course, very much encourage you to check them out and drop them a rating as well on Spotify and the Apples and the such likes, as you could, of course, do for Thinking Critically should you be feeling exceptionally generous. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and good night. And now it's time for the Patreon shout-outs. Thank you to Robert Hartley, DM for Viva la Dirt League and writer on the D&D Logic web series. I would encourage everybody to check him out at Robert Hartley GM on Twitter and Twitch. Thank you to Optional Rule, a 2-time guest of the show and a very insightful and knowledgeable source of information. Please check them out at www.optionalrule.com. Huge thank you to a great friend of the show, Matthew Perkins, who's out there making hilarious and educational Dungeons and Dragons content. Please go and check out his stuff at matthewperkins.net, where you can find links to all of his socials and all of his content, including his own Patreon, which I would very much encourage you to check out. Thank you to Matt Street at mpstreet88 on Twitter for supporting the show. If you need support running your personal or business schedule, head to virtualtimehustle.com or on Instagram to make that difference between should do and done. Boss it better with support from Kat, who will help you get back that essential time you've been searching for. If you would like to support what we do and get 4 shout-outs a month, head over to patreon.com/thinkingcritically, or you can just buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/thinkingcritically